Have you ever noticed how certain patterns in your life seem to repeat no matter how many times you promise yourself they won't happen again? You say the wrong thing in an argument and later think of the perfect response hours after it mattered. You trust someone who eventually disappoints you in the same familiar way. You procrastinate on something important even though you swore the last time would be the final time. And every time it happens, the same thought appears: why do I keep doing this? It feels almost irrational, like you are watching yourself walk into the same wall again and again, even though you already know it's there. Before we go deeper, if you've ever felt trapped in these repeating loops, where your intentions are clear, but your behavior seems to betray you, consider subscribing and leaving a like. This channel focuses on breaking down the psychological patterns behind everyday struggles that many people silently deal with. Sometimes the difference between feeling stuck and feeling understood is simply recognizing the hidden mechanism behind what keeps happening. Most people assume repeating mistakes is a discipline problem. They think it means they didn't try hard enough, didn't think carefully enough, or didn't learn their lesson. But the truth is more complicated than that. The human brain doesn't change behavior simply because it understands something logically. You can know exactly what the right choice is and still find yourself making the same decision you regret later. That gap between knowledge and action exists because behavior is controlled less by logic and more by patterns stored deep in the nervous system. Your brain is fundamentally a pattern detection machine. It learns from repetition and builds shortcuts that allow you to navigate life efficiently. These shortcuts are called behavioral loops. When a situation triggers a familiar emotional state, your brain automatically retrieves the response it has used before. This happens incredibly fast, often before conscious thought has time to intervene. That's why certain reactions feel almost automatic. You're not deciding in that moment. You're following a script your brain has already practiced. These scripts usually begin forming early in life. Your brain watches how people around you handle stress, conflict, affection, responsibility, and uncertainty. It observes what works and what doesn't, and it stores those observations as templates. Even if you intellectually disagree with those patterns later in life, the nervous system may still default to them under pressure because they feel familiar. Familiarity doesn't mean healthy, it simply means predictable. This explains why many repeated mistakes feel strangely comfortable in the moment, even if they create problems later. Your brain is not always optimizing for long-term success. It is often optimizing for immediate emotional relief. When you procrastinate, for example, the relief you feel from avoiding a difficult task reinforces the behavior, even though the long-term consequence is stress. The brain remembers that relief and stores it as part of the pattern. The same mechanism applies to relationships. If you grew up around certain emotional dynamics, such as inconsistency, criticism, or emotional distance, your brain may unconsciously seek out similar patterns later in life, not because you enjoy them, but because they feel familiar. Familiar environments require less prediction. They match the emotional map your brain already understands. This is why people sometimes find themselves repeating relationship mistakes even when they promise to choose differently. Another reason mistakes repeat is because awareness often arrives too late in the process. You might recognize the pattern only after it has already unfolded. By that point, the emotional reaction has already happened. The words have already been said. The decision has already been made. Reflection after the fact is useful for understanding, but it doesn't automatically change the automatic response that happens in the moment. There is also a neurological element to this. When you experience stress or emotional pressure, your brain shifts control away from the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for deliberate thinking and planning. Instead, it relies more heavily on older brain structures that prioritize habit and survival responses. In other words, when the stakes feel high, your brain stops experimenting and returns to what it already knows, even if what it knows is flawed. This is why repeating mistakes often feels most frustrating, during emotionally charged situations. You might remain calm and rational when analyzing the pattern afterward, but during the moment itself, the brain is operating under a completely different set of priorities. It's trying to stabilize the situation quickly, not optimize it intelligently. Self-criticism often makes the cycle worse. When people notice they are repeating mistakes, they respond with harsh internal dialogue. They tell themselves they are irresponsible, weak, or incapable of change. Unfortunately, this type of self-judgment activates the same stress systems that reduce cognitive flexibility. In other words, the more aggressively you attack yourself for repeating a mistake, the more likely you are to repeat it again. There's also an identity component involved. Over time, repeated behaviors can become woven into how you see yourself. If you start believing that you are the person who always messes this up, that identity subtly influences your expectations. Expectations influence attention. Attention influences behavior. Your brain begins scanning for evidence that confirms the identity it has already constructed. One of the most overlooked reasons mistakes repeat is because people focus on the behavior rather than the emotional trigger behind it. For example, someone might try to stop procrastinating by forcing themselves to start earlier. But if the procrastination is driven by fear of failure or fear of judgment, the underlying trigger remains untouched. The brain will continue searching for ways to escape that emotion, even if the specific behavior changes temporarily. To truly interrupt a repeating pattern, you have to move your awareness earlier in the sequence. Instead of noticing the mistake after it happens, you learn to recognize the emotional signal that precedes it, the moment of tension before the reaction, the hesitation before the decision, the familiar discomfort that usually leads to the same outcome. When you can identify that signal early enough, you create a brief window where conscious choice becomes possible. Another helpful shift is replacing judgment with curiosity. Instead of asking, "Why do I keep ruining this?" you ask, "What is my brain trying to protect me from here?" This question often reveals that the mistake is not random. It is serving a purpose, usually reducing anxiety, avoiding conflict, or protecting self-esteem in the short term. When you understand the function of the behavior, you can begin designing alternatives that satisfy the same emotional need without creating the same negative outcome. Changing patterns also requires patience with your nervous system. Habits formed through years of repetition cannot disappear instantly. Your brain will continue suggesting the familiar response even after you intellectually decide to behave differently. The goal is not to eliminate the old pattern immediately, but to weaken it gradually by choosing a different response when the opportunity appears. Each time you interrupt the automatic script, even slightly, you are rewiring the loop. At first, the difference may feel small. Maybe you pause before reacting. Maybe you speak a little more honestly than usual. Maybe you delay the habitual response long enough to notice it. These moments may seem insignificant, but they represent the exact point where the pattern begins to change. Over time, the brain learns that a new response is possible. The emotional trigger still appears, but the outcome is no longer predetermined. The space between impulse and action becomes wider. That space is where real change lives. Eventually, the mistakes that once felt inevitable begin to lose their grip, not because you became perfect, but because you learned to recognize the pattern before it fully unfolded. What once felt like a mysterious flaw in your character reveals itself as something far more understandable. A system repeating what it learned until you taught it something new. And once you see your behavior as a pattern rather than a personal failure, the question shifts. Instead of asking why you keep making the same mistakes, you start asking a more powerful question. What new pattern do I want my brain to learn next?